Hi, this is Dennis Dalton, the Flight Safety Officer for Peterson Air Force Base Aero Club. This November safety meeting is about no-time threats. Mitigating safety threats to flying that can be accomplished by identifying and reviewing no-time threats on every flight. No-time threats are those that require immediate action. The focus of this safety briefing is to increase awareness of these items, and therefore I'm focusing on the T-41C flight manual and emergency checklist procedures to avoid overcomplicating this presentation. The same safety awareness can be applied to the D model T-41 with constant speed prop and the 182s and the 172 mic, as well as the twin engine. The T-41 manual refers to these no-time threats as critical action procedures. And it defines that as those actions which must be performed immediately if the emergency is not to be aggravated and injury or damage is to be avoided. These critical steps will be committed to memory. Dramatic events that require prompt corrective action happen so rarely but require an immediate rote response. It should be briefed and reviewed before every flight. So how would we do that? Well, a self-briefing is one way, or a crew briefing is commonly done. If I was to paraphrase in here real quickly, I know that probably on every check ride, all pilots are told to do your emergency failure briefing on departure, which is one, as well as checking seat belts and all other safety features, especially when you have an examiner on board. Well, it's in the vein of that approach, that it's something that I guess a lot of us, myself included, would get out of the habit of doing, which if some of these things which I've collected here today could be at least talked about and briefly gone over, as they do on all professional flight decks, it can really enhance the safety of the flight in case any one of these things might happen. So in other words, again, a self-briefing or crew briefing should be done covering the most pertinent threats on every takeoff and approach to landing, which is where you're close to the ground. If the pilot is not flying solo and capable persons are present, this briefing should include who flies the airplane, who communicates with ATC, and reads the emergency checklist and other things which you tell non-pilots that are flying in the front seat is, don't touch anything, keeping your hands in your lap. I think that there's all levels to that, and I think that the more we communicate in the event of something happening, the better it would be for the outcome. And I know that again, it's one of those things that I think is very, very important, as well as all of the other electronics that we're all burdened with these days. So the following is my list of 7 no-time threats that should be verbally briefed before every takeoff and before every approach to landing. Some of these, you could break these down and say, well, obviously the engine failure immediately after takeoff would be done before you take off. The engine failure and landing phase within 1,000 feet AGL could be done as you're approaching the airport. Electrical fires, although could happen at any time, could be talked about once, practically before the flight, just quickly, especially with people that may not be familiar with the aircraft. an engine fire, and engine prop noise or extreme vibrations, go-arounds, which may seem like a regular event, I don't think are practiced enough, and there are situations where a go-around could be exciting, if not catastrophic. Wind shear also, which I'll talk about. And again, all of these, I'm not really wanting to go over the checklist, really, and the emergency checklist again, and going through those things. I'm simply trying to identify a certain number of things that can streamline the process of using the emergency checklist. So many times I ask students, if you ask a student to do something and they haven't been briefed for it, they may pick up the checklist, but they may not have it exactly opened to the emergency pages. And which emergency thing would you be, looking for, and what page is it on, and things like that, and covering precious time. So I think there's certain things here which, if they were briefed verbally, could save precious time until you get into the flow of the emergency checklist. Okay, there was a little technical difficulty there. Apparently the, for some reason I couldn't back up. It doesn't matter, here I am. Okay, so I was talking about the engine failure on landing, and so I think one of the things is determining your altitude immediately, how much altitude you have to deal with, which is going to tell you how far you can go. And if you're already in the traffic pattern, of course, doing a 180 power off landing is very helpful to determining your speed control, which would be the 85 miles an hour, until you put in flaps when you're sure you have the runway. Of course, a T-41 does pretty good gliding, but I think practicing this maneuver, maybe if you're up and you're going to do a few practice landings, can be very helpful. But again, the runways are so long that it would be more helpful if you picked a spot, and for a spot landing. And even if you don't hit it exactly right, it's just like the private pilot criteria, as long as you're not short, but not too far past. When you get better at that, going out in the practice area and practicing, as long as you don't go below the safe VFR minimums, which is 500 feet, or the SOPs. Okay, electrical fire. Practice shutting off all electrical power immediately. Concentrate on flying the airplane. I think, yes, turning off the master right away is going to fix that, hopefully. Of course, I can't say what happens all the time. They talk about fire meaning it's overloading a wire. The wire is burning all the insulation off. Most aircraft interiors are made of things that aren't supposed to burn, but they do melt. And of course, I will talk about that a little later. I've been in a real life electrical meltdown, and it's a lot of real weird smell and smoke. And the only way it goes away is it burns all the insulation off, or you shut the power off, and then it's still going to burn it off till the wire cools off. Then you got the smell to get rid of. So anyway, if turning off, but this is interesting in stuff that that's tucked away in that T-41 emergency checklist. If turning off the master switch eliminates the fire situation, the master switch, leave it off. Do not attempt to isolate the source of the fire by checking each individual electrical component with the master switch on. Now this is talking about electrical fire. This isn't talking about an electrical problem like a blown fuse. See, so I think there's a distinction to be made there. And I think if you've got something that's melting, it's not a good idea to try and isolate that because, you know, you don't know what it is. And I'll tell you from personal experience that once one thing melts, it melts everything next to it. And then you have a bunch of wires with no insulation on them under there, which then it's not, you aren't going to be able to isolate anything. Smoke and fume elimination. Accomplish this procedure anytime smoke or toxic odors are detected in the cabin. Cabin heat knob in, which in the summertime isn't a problem because it's never out. Cabin air knob in, and why? Because, well, it's pulling air from underneath the dash, which is pulling all that smoke and stuff right up into your face. Air vents open, that's a good idea. They're just coming in from the wing openings up at the root, and that's going to be some fresh air. Pilot's window as required. If necessary, window may be open to assist the flow of air is what that says back behind there. Yes, there is kind of a real low pressure outside the window, and that does help. Of course, on the instructor side, the window doesn't open, but opening the door would probably work. I'm mentioning here and these are the next the remainder here, which is engine fire during flight, extreme engine noise or noise vibration, go-arounds, and wind shear. But I wanted to go over here first and talk briefly here the glide procedure. You know, it's the same for every emergency maneuver. The maximum glide distance is obtained by flaps up in 85 miles an hour, as I said previously, which will give you about 600 foot per minute descent. Lowering the flaps will increase angle and rate of descent, which would be an emergency descent, which we would talk about here as engine fire during flight. Mixture full lean. You want to cut off fuel to the engine, fuel knob shut off, pull out, cut off fuel to the engine compartment. Ignition switch off. Why? Well, because you don't want the engine to windmill and fire back up if you've got the mag P-lead still not grounded. Warning, do not attempt to restart the engine. It's been shut down due to engine fire. Pick a suitable field, continue with forced landing. Emergency descent glide would be over here. Probably you would want a slow speed. Over 20 degrees of flaps, probably full flaps, as long as you're in the white arc, full flaps. Keeping your speed low, it's going to go down pretty fast without gaining speed if you maintain that first. You don't want to start dive bombing at 110 and then try and crank out all these flaps. You get that thing slow and then go down. You don't want to just dive down there, because once you're down there, you got a flaming, you're sitting in a flaming can, and you're going past all these places you'd like to get out, but you're doing about 100, so you can't really get out. So you really got to get slow, but then get down fast. Let's see. I thought I wanted to say something else about this. Oh, yeah. I had okay. One day we're there. We're going to pull a plane out. It's the first one coming out of the morning. I think it was a Sunday morning. I look under there as a spot of something wet under the cowling. I go, oh boy, well that's not oil. What is that? It's fuel. Now, if that plane would have been pulled out and nobody looked at that, I wouldn't have noticed it was there. Okay, said, I'm not flying that. Where's that gas coming from? That doesn't look right. We had to take all the cowling off. We had to get in there. There was a cracked line on the collector injector where all the lines come together. I don't know if you call that a spider or something or other. But anyway, where all the lines come together, one of them, the feeder line was cracked in the back. And I think I called Neil that morning. But anyway, I said, man, whoever flew that the night before, that thing was cracked and it's dumping gas on the engine. So if that would have been pulled out and I didn't see that puddle, it'd be like, hey, let's go. and you get up there and gas is dripping on it all this time, then you probably would have ended up with one of these guys. And then the only way, right, is would that have been the mixture? Would have maybe. This probably would have shut it off, and you sure wouldn't want that thing starting up again. But you would have had a fire up, and man, that would have been, that stuff was running down the engine, all down the back and everything. It wasn't a big puddle. I would say maybe overnight there might have been a pint of fuel. I mean, those lines are small. They're 1/8-inch lines, and it was like, cracked. Okay. Extreme engine or prop noise vibration during flight. This should be treated as a partial or complete engine failure in flight. Reduce power, establish for safe airspeed. Again, this established thing here is like if you're not going into a glide and you just want to slow the airplane down, you need to have a power setting and a trim for level flight that is a minimum speed so you can sort things out. And in those airplanes, unless you feel that you have to close the throttle to do that, the best thing is to come up with a couple target things for yourself. First thing I would say is, well, pull it back to 1700. If you trim that for level flight, you're going to be at about 85. If you don't like that, you pull the power and you start going down. And 100 RPM, sometimes 125, sometimes 150 RPM, will relate to about 100 feet a minute descent. And that's something I would touch on later with something else. But in any event, this is something else that happened to me. So yeah, you can't let that thing keep vibrating. That's no good. It scares the crap out of you. Go arounds, full power, flaps retract, trim set. Now, these are something that could be practiced and should be practiced, so it's a rote thing, because not only is it full power, flaps retract, trim set, but you're pushing forward on the yoke until you get that trim refigured, because if you're down there with full flaps, right, and you put in the full power, you could have a trim stall, which is one thing you do practice. So you basically got to push forward until you get that trim straightened out. So you got to do 3 things at once. Wind shear immediate, that's power and trim adjustment, is what it says under the picture. I did that. I did a safety meeting. It was two months ago, and I think all of these scenarios, and there were planes from here, KCOS, and also from the Air Force Academy, and all of the accidents were takeoffs, and all of them were crosswind gusts. In some cases, the gusts weren't that bad. They were like 15 knots, but there was no application of controls, too late application of power, sitting there waiting to see if it's going to get better, or maybe you're going to take off. That didn't work. So you ended up with airplanes flipping over, sliding sideways, flipping over, going into the grass, tipping over, and that's something you have to act on immediately. So those are the 7, I guess, immediate things that I think require you can't get the checklist out for. You don't have time. You do get the checklist out later and double check your work. Once you get things at least a little bit under control, something you might have forgot, but at least you have a temporary stabilized situation, and that's what I'm talking about. And reviewing those before the flight, very good. Now we're into the general emergency threats, which aren't any less of a threat. And my reasoning here is general emergency threats can be reviewed on a regular basis, twice a year, or even once a month. You go out there, why don't you try going over a couple emergency procedures. The Aero Club requires an initial and annual standardization written exam and flight review. These should be considered the bare minimum If you're current in an aircraft you were initially checked out in, it may have been years since you reviewed the make and model written or the emergency closed book test. Here we go again, it's behind my picture. These could be included in your FAA 2-year review at a minimum. Maybe that's one thing you should be going over all the time. Maybe it will never happen to you, but I will address that at the end here because it happened to me. It happens all the time. Things like this happen all the time. General emergency threats with limited reaction time. This is out of the T-41 manual, outlines actions which contribute to an orderly sequence of events. This will ensure that all supporting preparations are made after initiating the critical emergency actions, which is what I just talked about. Improve chances for the emergency actions. This should be a 2 to be successful, and serve as cleanup items. And so in here what I did, with those with limited time, I only picked out a few. It's like I didn't go over everything in the emergency checklist. That would take forever. And that's not what I'm doing here. I'm just talking just a little bit in some of the things that I found in the T-41 emergency checklist that I thought were interesting and pertinent to this presentation. And as well, I put together a no-time checklist for general emergency here, just a very small one. Okay, an engine failure may or may not give you prior warning. Prior warning is normally in the form of a rough running engine, loss of oil pressure, sudden or uncontrollable rise in oil temperature, sudden rise in oil pressure, or fluctuating RPM. Now, this no-time checklist for general emergencies, all I did was say, well, are you going to try and restart this thing or not? Well, if you got fuel fumes, no. You got internal damage suspected or unusual noise or vibration? No, not a good idea. Oil system malfunction, sudden rise or drop in pressure or temperature, and the engine fails? No, I wouldn't waste my time with that. You're just going to wreck it some more. Boy, what did I say here? Engine fails if the engine fails for any other reason, which you can't determine, like it probably ran out of gas, then a restart is warranted. One thing about this, which I will just point out real quick about the oil system in these, all these engines have a bypass valve, which is simply this plug with a spring in it. And well, it's a little more than that, but it's a very simple thing. But if that were somehow to fail, I'm not sure how it would. It could get full of stuff or something. Actually, the oil pressure will go up and down with the throttle. As you move the throttle and the engine goes faster or slower, the oil pressure goes up and down. And that could be somewhat concerning or frightening. It's not. But understanding your engine and understanding what's going on is helpful. It's actually anyway, I don't have to get into that right now, but the oil system, and you can read that in the emergency checklist. We could spend a whole evening just on this. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things about oil and what that oil pressure gauge is doing and what it can tell you. And in some cases, it's your temperature gauge, So, because you don't have a CHT in those. Okay. Other general threats, there's only these three I want to wrap this up with. I didn't want to get into Ds and 182s, but here I am doing it. Because this is probably a whole not really a safety meeting, but this is a whole discussion on glide. With propeller milling at full increase will be significantly less. The glide will than a T41C. And you'd be taught that anyway if you were transitioning to the D or the 182s. If oil pressure is available, the prop may still be controllable. In such an event, moving the prop to full decrease will provide the optimum glide distance. Well, full in is increase. Full out is decrease. If it's full in, the prop pitch is flat, which means it's got a lot of drag. If the engine fails it's going to default to that. It's got springs in there and it'll default to flat. They're always talking about, well, it might not. Well, I don't know how it's not going to do that. But anyway, that's not I got a story anyway at the end here. Oil, because that happened to me too. If oil pressure is available, but the engine didn't quit, then the engine's kind of running a little bit. And there's a whole paragraph or two on that, because if you got some oil pressure, then you can control the pitch, which is around 14 and a half degrees of range that you have in there. And if you can control it, it doesn't mean pull it all the way towards you or pull it all the way out so you can glide farther. It means, but then you don't have any power at that point. And if you need power to increase the glide, you might want it not all the way out, but part way in, but all the way in is going to give you too much drag. So, you should read that. But that's one thing that can be briefed in that. It's not, you don't just put it one place and leave it. And that's really not in an emergency checklist. They say this, which is not very helpful. Baggage door open, you got to return to land. I guess that one, it can be very disconcerting. It's not as noisy as the seatbelt. You leave the seatbelt out. That's happened how many times to me? And when I was younger, yeah, you leave, you just get in and, did you put your seatbelt on? Well, I didn't do any briefing, did I? And bang, 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 bang. Boy, that's noisy. You're going to say, hey, open the door with no seatbelt on and reach out and get it? Right. No, that's not a good idea. So you turn around and land. Baggage door, yeah, don't climb back there. You're not going to be able to get back there anyway. Partial power failure. That's probably the least hard to make a judgment on what to do there. But that's a threat that, you have to get this thing, and it'll say right here, let me see here, partial engine failure may occur for several reasons, including such malfunctions as erratic engine-driven fuel pump, fuel leak, abnormal combustion, improper positioning of a switch or knob. Yeah, this could be somebody, I'll tell you one thing about this improper positioning of a switch or knob. If the manual prime switch is not in and locked like everybody just does all the time when they're doing their run up, in and locked. Okay, let's go. We haven't used it anyway. We don't use that to prime the engine. We use the throttle and the fuel pump and get the GPH up. Well, if that thing's not hooked up and it's kind of part way out, it can create a rich situation if it's, fuel is leaking through that plunger because the plunger's not closed. And that could be causing it. That could be it. You need to establish a glide, fly the airplane correctly, and determine then what's happening. So that's a little more, you're trying to fix a situation then, not just looking for a place to land, but then you are looking for a place to land unless you can maintain altitude. So this one is very, this one's has a lot more gray areas to it. Several indications usually accompanying power loss, fluctuating RPM, possible high oil temperature, or rough vibrating engine. A check of instruments may provide you with valuable information for regaining control if level flight cannot be maintained. And I think what that says is 85 miles an hour will still provide optimum glide performance. Even if you are producing power, you'll just go farther. Okay, so the final things in emergency checklists, which aren't all on the checklist, but they do say in the T41 manual, and we're getting to the end here, looks like the sun's changing, so I'm getting some different light on my monitor face here. To assist the pilot when an emergency occurs, 3 basic rules are established which apply to all emergencies. Maintain control of the aircraft, analyze the situation, land as soon as conditions permit. We could go through these real quick. Bird strike. Well, certainly aircraft control is probably always possible, even in this case here. These things will fly okay, even with a big hole in them. It's not something that's probably going to fly very good. That's a big bird. Analyzing the situation and land is practicable. That's electrical failure. That's going to be fairly insidious. Aircraft control is probably something that shouldn't be a problem. Analyzing the situation, well, usually electrical failure is a dead battery, and you'll find that out because the transponder is not working properly, or ATC will tell you it's not working properly, which is your first red flag. And the first place I'd go when they called me up is I look and see if the light's blinking on the transponder, and a lot of times it probably isn't. The other thing is I would look at the amp gauge, which may or may not tell you, but I would guess that the battery's probably been running on empty for the last hour, and that's why that's happening. That's not detrimental, but before you run out of complete COM electricity, I would shut that transponder off and talk to them and say, give me some lights, and I'm saving everything, and let's go back. And that's happened to me before. Instrument equipment failures. I think what maintaining aircraft control here is, well, if you don't have any instruments, it's a known pitch power combination based on a trimmed airplane. So before you change anything, you know it's trimmed. That you got to assume, first of all, it's in semi-trimmed, more or less level flight, based on what power configuration you're in now. So if you push the power in, it's going to go up. If you pull the power back, it's going to go down. But you need to look at where it's at before you touch anything, because as soon as you pull 100 RPM off, right, it's going to go down 100 feet a minute. Now, if you close the throttle and you try and trim it, and it's nighttime or it's instruments, you don't know where you're at. So you don't want to do that. But your power, your tachometer, if the engine quit, you're in a glide. So the tachometer's not working. But if the tach's working, you look and see where it's at, and you got it trimmed for level flight, then those are your instruments. You got a tach, and that's it. And as long as you don't touch the trim, you know if you take some off or put some in, it's going to go up or down that much. And that's really an important thing I feel in this one. Unusual noise or vibration, you should be always listening for that. One thing about those headsets, those self-noise canceling headsets, is that you can't hear anything. So again, we're almost done. Okay, everybody's heard of ILAFFT. Every pilot has I laughed experiences sooner or later. These are a couple of selective experiences I've had. It's often said that the departure and landing phase of flight is the most vulnerable. The following experiences seem to bear that out. These are some no-time threats. These are all things that have happened to me. Climb out, partial power loss in the 182 RG. Well, first thing you got to do is lower the nose. See how much power you actually got. Do you have enough to turn around and land the airplane? Partial power loss is better than all power loss. I'm not going to go into the reasons and what happened, but none of these had a disastrous event. But some of them were scarier than others. Departure, climb out, electrical fire in my airplane. That's the one. Yeah, I had a lot of green smoke. That was a real out of nowhere situation. And yes, turn off the master. Fortunately, and man, I always say it wasn't night and it wasn't IFR, because that taught me that, if it's night and it's IFR, yikes, you better have some others. And it wasn't something that you can plan for. That was an expensive one. It was a COM ground wire, and it just happened to decide that was when it was going to hit the bus bar and melt everything. Electrical flat motor failure and full down deflection on go-around in 177. There's a go-around thing where it's like, okay, hey, that was a great landing. Let's go around. Well, you put in the power, you're rolling down the runway to take off. You put the flaps up, and I go, hey, this isn't weird. This is kind of weird. What's happening? You look out the window, and the flaps are still all the way down. The switch is broke. Now what? Man, I ain't going to take off and try and climb out with 40 degrees of flaps in 177. That ain't happening. So down, that thing's got to go right back down. I don't care how we get on the ground. We're just dropping it right back down on the ground on the runway. And that's what we did. Because that one would have taken forever to climb anywhere so you could turn. Jeez, that was the scariest, believe it or not, the weirdest one next to this. Climb out prop pitch failure on one blade. I don't know. If Neil's in the audience, he'll say, what? That was the Hartzell. And you know, there's this little block in there, and you can't see those things on the pre-flight. And that was back when I was having the prop done, just having the AD done and not having them overhaul it, and the little block fell out on one side. So you know that's what holds the blade in steady pitch. So one blade was fluctuating, and that was vibrating like crazy. What can you do? You got to reduce power, put the nose over. You got to go back and you got to land it. You know, and try not to put in a lot of power, because that manifold pressure was all over the place, because that one prop just did whatever it wanted, one side. Emergency threats with limited reaction time. Takeoff roll on a 172 RG power loss. That was on a high speed rollout. It just had a weird mixture problem. This is a gear motor failure on my 260 again. That was on downwind. Those are limited reaction time, but you know, you could fly around all day with the gear up till you figured it out. You know, but it's mostly, you know, the gear motor just pop the fuse, and then you just got to do a manual extension. Sometimes it's later to go up, out, do the extension. On the 182s, it's a little more involved, and I don't think staying in the pattern if you're single pilot is a good idea, especially at KCOS. This didn't happen. This happened down in 4V1, so I actually could get it down while I was still in downwind, because those are, well, I'm familiar with it, and those are easier to do. You don't do a bunch of pumping. You just disconnect the screw jack, grab that handle, and pull it. So it's a little better. Okay, well, anyway, these things are there, and it's really, you know, any of these situations could have been worse. If you don't maintain control, assess the situation to solve the problem, but maintaining control above everything else. This concludes the safety presentation for 2021. There isn't one next month since it's Christmas, you know, holidays and that. January safety presentation will include the past year accomplishments. This looks like this looks like me here. So this and here's a projector. That must have been a while ago. Anyway, this is one of our potlucks in here there. So have a great holiday, safe holiday, and I hope I'll see you next year. Okay, that's it.